Hi, my name is Randy Lubin from Leveraged Play. I design serious games that help folks explore the future and explain complex systems. And today I want to be talking about how to co-design Foresight games, especially with collaborators and bigger organizations that might not have experience with game design. To set some context, I've designed a lot of different types of games, and it ranges from in-person mega games with dozens of people, 50 people running around, and a whole team of facilitators, to more intimate games with just 5 or 6 people focused on telling a really specific story or exploring very specific questions. I've also done plenty of games digitally over video chat with people running around digital spaces, as well as single-player video games, browser-based video games that help explore the nuances of tricky topics like trust and safety, or on mobile-optimized devices, content moderation, all of which have been designed with bigger organizations ranging from the United Nations to Hewlett Foundation, World Economic Forum, UNICEF, etc. And I'm really mining from all those experiences when I come up with some of the advice that I'm going to share on this call. And the one example I'll be returning to a bit is this game Futurecast, which we released with the United Nations Global Pulse last year, about exploring uncertainties, opportunities, and threats in countries around the world to make better strategic decisions and planning within United Nations teams. That ended up being a physical game that we released a whole template and kit for, so that anyone can remix it and customize it for their own specific area of focus, their own context, their own questions they want to answer. So with that, let's talk about agenda. I'm going to break this talk into 3 main areas. One, how to onboard new collaborators and get them confident and comfortable in talking about games, especially if they're not game designers or even game players. Then we're going to talk about getting and keeping team alignment. And finally, we're going to explore the stage gate design process, which I absolutely love and I think goes a long way toward helping to ensure and enable fruitful collaboration. So let's start with that onboarding advice. The first thing I do, and I do this enthusiastically, is say that everybody can design. And I really believe that's true, and I really drill into this and share some examples to help all collaborators feel confident contributing their ideas and feeling like they have a seat at the table when it comes to designing a game. And usually I start by saying, hey, games are just a small subset of experience design with lots of different overlap. Overlap from workshop and facilitation design, theater design, and then I go even broader than that. I say, hey, look, if you've ever planned a birthday party or tried to figure out the best way to run a meeting, that's experience design. And the intuitions you've honed there, the patterns you've encountered, the things you felt worked, all of that has a bearing on games as well. So bring all of that to the table when you're collaborating on designing a game. And there's one specific quote, which I love, 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 cannot figure out who first said it, but I encountered it from the theater community, and it's that an experience starts the moment that you first hear about it, and it ends the last time you think about it. So really going from just the game experience and expanding it and expanding it and expanding it and saying, hey, everything, that whole experience duration can be designed and should be designed, and there should be thought and care and attention brought to that. So have a more expansive definition of the experience than just what happens during a game session. The next step in the onboarding is I try and build some games literacy. This is to again, better enable collaborators to have a conversation about the game that we want to make to accomplish our goals. There's usually a few steps to this, but first I'll start by sort of setting some baseline of what are games even good for? Why are we talking about using games? And so depending on the group, I'll go in more or less depth and give lots of juicy examples, but I'll talk about how it's really good for building intuition by getting players to really engage with mechanics and see how their actions result in a change in the state of the game, state of the world that's being modeled. Then we'll talk about how games can be really good for building empathy and intuition for people who are not like themselves in situations not like themselves. And sometimes that's through playing that role, and sometimes that's through seeing in action other players responding to the incentives that are steering their role. Finally, I'll talk about how games are just so amazing for creativity, and a lot of that comes down to constraints, and that by putting all sorts of constraints on actions players can do or ways players can be brainstorming and sharing can be really liberating and help people come up with ideas that they might not have otherwise in a less gameful workshop or setting. And so I really, really love the creativity aspect. It also, I think it's great for leveling a playing field between experts and non-experts, and very importantly, creates an alibi. An alibi in that you can throw out ideas and take actions, make suggestions that are a lot bolder than you might in a normal corporate setting or drier setting where you're bringing your persona as an expert, or you're putting your as whatever you are in your career. You might be more limited, whereas as soon as you get in a game context, it can be very freeing. Then I'll talk a little bit about like when can you use games and like we're in a broader process. So I think it's great for early in a process when you're brainstorming, trying to get lots of ideas out. I think it's great for when you already have some ideas and you're trying to refine them down and see, this might be part of like a strategic planning process, and say, okay, we have a few candidates for strategic plans. Let's game out and see where they might work, where they might fail, what are our blind spots. And finally, they're really good for communicating. So maybe you've already come up with a plan you're really excited about, or you've come up with some very powerful scenarios for the future, but you want them to reach a larger audience, perhaps within your organization, perhaps outside your organization. Games can be a really lightweight way and fun way of getting folks to engage with the work that you've done. So all of these are different places that games can live, and the place that you're using them probably will inform the type of game that you create with its different affordances, its different types of complexity. So being really intentional about where are we deploying games can be great. And finally, depending on the audience, I'll call out how games can democratize foresight in general, or democratize planning process, or whatever else it might be. But the idea is that by having a game, you could be encouraging more participation, partly by just having a larger volume of people engage with the process, partly because it lowers the barrier to participation. A thoughtful designed game can be very approachable and accessible, and also it creates a very structured way for people to offer their views or hopes or preferences. I think it's great for empowering communication as well. So again, getting either you're empowering the communication of people who have different views of the future or different preferences, or you're communicating that future back out in a much more scalable way, perhaps than a report or again, just something that lives in an organization and doesn't have reach beyond it. And then finally, and this is really, really important, I think games can be great for supporting other workflows. And so that could be about, where you, again, like we were talking about on the previous slide, like how do you embed games in a much bigger workflow? How do you have the inputs from earlier in the workflow feed into the game, and the outputs from the game itself support whatever the next activity is in that workflow? And we're going to talk about that a little more in a little bit. One of the final activities I'll do as I'm trying to really build a good baseline of games literacy is explore game types and activity types that might be remixed in, or we might draw inspiration from as we design our game, our experience. If there's time, ideally we'll play some of these games together and really get a visceral sense of what does it mean to be this type of game or that type of game. But bearing that, I'll try and give case studies or specific examples. This could be a video in its own right, and hopefully I'll come back and create one that's just like, let's look at a bunch of different games and how they might be harnessed for foresight. But in this case in particular, I'll talk about, the vocab games, might be divorced, where the mechanics might have nothing to do with the topic at hand, but in playing the game, you're getting used to a lot of the jargon, a lot of the just terminology that's used by the specific area that we're studying, which is okay and can be helpful and has its place. But then as you start going down this list, you start getting more involved, where the game has a lot more to do with the topic at hand, the context. And so, board games are pretty good at mapping the dynamics of whatever world system onto a game board or game context. Storytelling games, likewise, can be really honed to make it so that the mechanics of the game are mapping to whatever the dynamics are that are most important to explore. So I'll walk through these game types. I'll also pull in ideas from interactive theater or alternate reality games. Again, just expanding a little bit the bubble of like what we talk about when we talk about games. And then on the activity type side, it's really just about, these are different things that might have a role at different times during the game itself. So keep this in mind, right? We might be doing lightweight brainstorming or arts and crafts. And again, normally you might not think of arts and crafts and board games in the same sentence or the same sort of activity type. But all of these are things that can happen within a game's context and could be really fruitful at getting creativity from the players, or helping certain key insights surface, or certain key insights land within a given player base. So we'll walk through game types and activity types. Ideally, we'll play a little bit, and then we're pretty much ready to move on to getting and keeping team alignment. And I think this is so important, especially when you're working with a bigger team, a team with very diverse backgrounds, and a team within organizations with competing priorities. Getting that initial team alignment and keeping it is just so crucial to ensuring good outcomes for this project. And so We're going to talk about this in 3 quick steps. We're going to talk about having explicit goals and constraints, having living documentation, and having a really good stakeholder overviews to help communicate out what we're doing to other stakeholders beyond just who's on the core design team. The game design document, I actually already have a video up on YouTube. I'll link to it below. But it's a lengthy, could be a somewhat lengthy document talking about the purpose of the game, key goals and constraints, which we'll get to in a second, and then lots of other things from like a project timeline to lots of the ideas or specifics of how the game is being designed, as well as like a timeline and key questions, and there's lots and bits and pieces of it. There's a whole video, you can check it out, but right now I want to talk about the design guidelines section of it. And this is where it is so helpful to get alignment by making really explicit what are the desired insights that we want to get out of this game, out of running this game potentially multiple times with different audiences. What do we need to learn? Part of that also is like, what are the key inputs? Like, in order to run this game successfully, is this downstream of a scenario planning process where we want to use those created scenarios, or are we maybe to flip that around and say maybe this is a brainstorm that will help set up really fruitful scenario creation, so we know that an output of this needs to be a lot of specific ideas that are going to flow in there, or maybe this is going to flow into some sort of report that's looking at threats and opportunities. So like, let's make sure we design a game that the threats and opportunities are really explicit and captured by the players and the facilitators so that they can then be worked into a report. All of this, again, like very, very helpful to focus everybody. And then key constraints, of course, being really explicit of like, is this an hour game or 3-hour game? Is it for, groups of 50 or groups of 5? And are there certain topics that are allowed or prohibited? And again, by teasing out these constraints, it could be that different collaborators are coming with very different ideas of what the constraints are. And so it's a good way of getting everybody on the same page. And this deeply will inform the early design process and make sure that you're not spending a lot of time exploring design space that ultimately will be not feasible or not helpful for the goals of the project. So here are just some examples I have on the screen from the FutureCast game that we worked on with the UN. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'll just call out a few in particular. So on the goal side, a lot about understanding threats and opportunities, feeding into big analysis reports that were going to be happening downstream of the activity. One interesting one I'll call out here is creating value for the participants. So we were having external participants here, and it was really important to us that they came out of the experience feeling like they had a really good time. Like, so they didn't want something that generated great insights for our team for the process, but that didn't leave the participants themselves feeling good about it. So we need to make sure that they were getting insights and ahas, and we made sure we built that into the game and into the debrief too, to make sure it was a valuable use of their time. On the constraint side, typically, things like I had mentioned previously, you can see attendees, duration, etc. One thing that was unique to this one that I hadn't experienced on a prior project was political sensitivities. We knew we'd be running this game in a fragile democracy, and we wanted to be very careful not to put any of our facilitators or participants at risk. We didn't want them to get into trouble with the government of the country we were running it in, and we also didn't want to risk harming or stressing the relationship between the United Nations itself and the country government. And so we knew, okay, no matter what, we need to make sure that if somebody shares what happened in the session, or if documents or notes from the session got out, no one was at risk. It was fine. Whoever saw it, there's nothing that was going to be super threatening. So with that, let's jump forward to the next step, which is about stakeholder overviews, and that's about the game and the process. And this is very simple, just having a way to communicate to folks who are not on the core design team, what is this thing we're making, and what is the process by which we're making it. And that's because oftentimes, especially when you're dealing with a big organization, there are other folks who are like loosely aware of what you're doing or getting up to speed, or maybe certain collaborators are using it to share and promote and align other key parts upstream, downstream, or they're trying to recruit players or whatever it might be. The idea is ideally have like a little paragraph pitch for the game and a paragraph pitch for the process. The process one is so that folks can understand where we're at, why we're doing what we're doing, and how they might be able to help. And so maybe a paragraph each, and depending on the needs, maybe have like a little slide deck for each too, to make it really easy for collaborators to just go and share that, and keeping that up to date throughout the whole process. So with that, we're going to move on to the next big chunk of what we're going to talk about, which is the stage gate process. I love this. I will use this just on my own if I'm designing a game without any collaborators, but I think it really sings when you have a big group for reasons that will hopefully become evident soon. I did not invent this. Stage gate process comes originally from, I think, industrial product design, But it was popularized to me by, I believe, Daniel Cook of Lost Garden. I'll have a link to his article, which really blew me away when I read it ages ago, and really informed how I do a lot of the more formal design process. So that being said, what's the stage gate process? Stage gate, there's a stage 0, which is coming up with goals and constraints that we just talked about, but then it's a process of going through different stages, and throughout each stage of the design process, there's a bunch of gates, and so you come up with a bunch of ideas. Some of them clear the gate and move it on to the next stage. Some of them don't, and you can always remix from what doesn't. And after each gate, each next stage is a little more refined, a little more polished, a little more closer to the final output of what you're making. And so with this stage gate process, I'll walk you through all the stages, but the idea is that you start with a sort of stage 0 of goals and constraints. Then you have a design brainstorm to come up with lots and lots of ideas that are going to be the fodder for coming up with pitches and actually incorporating into the game in lots of different ways as you go. Then you synthesize those into quick pitches, and the quick pitches step could be multiple stages depending on how you want to break things out. Then one of my favorite steps, which isn't a term that I see a ton, is playstorming, which is highly improvisational and all about getting lots of insights quickly, halfway between a brainstorm and a playtest. Then you playtest, which is a little bit more polished and refined as a step. And then finally, there's publish and launching the game. And so I'm going to walk you through all those stages right now. So let's start with design and brainstorm. And I'm going to talk through the what and the why of it. So in design brainstorming, it's a brainstorm as you might expect. The what of it is you're really going to be brainstorming lots of little bits of like fragments of ideas that might be worked into a game. You're going to focus on what format might this game take. Is this a video game? Is it a 50-person game with people running around? Is it a solo journaling game? Tons of directions to go in. Then you can talk about different mechanics. So maybe there is a little stock market thing happening, or maybe there's like a market where you can buy different advantages or disadvantages, or maybe your mechanic, there's an election going on, so a lot of the mechanics involve interfering with the election, whatever it might be. Likewise, are there really cool narrative beats you want to hit, whether player-driven or driven by the facilitators, or wow moments? And I'm a big believer in peak end experience design. So what is like the most big wow moment, and how does the story or the game end? And really making sure that you nail those. And so like thinking through what are some moments that will really blow away the players and support the design that we're doing. All good things to just capture in a big brainstorm. The reason why we start with a big brainstorm is it generates ideas. It continues to build on the game literacy. Again, like as people who are not as comfortable maybe with participating or brainstorming this way start seeing the other ideas. Well, now they're familiar with these ideas to reincorporate or bring them back later, but also it might help spur them to come up with their own ideas. Finally, it helps understand preferences and discover extra constraints that were not explicit before. You can look at all these things coming out and start having a conversation of like, oh, well, that wow moment sounds awesome, but we don't have the budget for an animatronic spaceship. I don't know, just to make an example. Maybe that wasn't explicit before, it can be explicit now. Or maybe we discovered that's awesome, but it's going to require a team of like 10 facilitators to run. Let's dial this back a little bit. Or hey, maybe actually let's go for more budget because we think this is worth trying to expand our constraints for. So after the design brainstorm, you move on to quick pitches. Usually what happens is after this like big mess of a brainstorm, we then try and distill it into somewhere between 3 to 8 pitches. And these can be very distinct game types. So sometimes we'll be exploring both digital and physical game options at the same time. Or sometimes there's minor variations on the same theme. And as you get to more refined pitches, because as I said, this itself could be a multi-stage process. Usually you end up with zooming in on, okay, so we know we want in person, we know we want under 2 hours, and we know it's roughly type of game A. What are 2 different versions of that? You want to include what are the key details of this? This might start off as a short phrase of like what the pitch is, but quickly evolve into like a sentence. Or as you're refining it and remixing it, you might end up with like paragraph pitches. So it might go from like 8 different sentence pitches to 4 different paragraph pitches to 2 different one-pagers. And then from there, you might have just like one main doc of like, cool, this is the direction we're going in. Lots of opportunities to remix, especially if this is a multi-step process of like, okay, cool, I really liked design. I really liked pitch A and B. Why don't we remix the 2 of them and come up with something that is like the best of both worlds? And in doing so, you're getting through these increasingly detailed iterations and hopefully converging on the ultimate game direction that you're going to take. This is really good because it helps you converge. It helps you continue to understand trade-offs. You'll see what attracts people to different options, and understand again, like, okay, we like option A because of these factors and B because of these factors. Maybe we can synthesize the 2. And also, really importantly, this builds excitement because this goes often where you go from nebulous, we want to make a game, to I can actually picture this. I can see people playing this and I can see them having fun. And that's really rewarding for the team and good at getting that momentum going, especially when you're about to jump into the actual meat of the designing and writing the rules. So with that, the next step for me, and again, I love this, is playstorming. So what is playstorming? I think of it as a partial test or simulation. So this is not sitting down and running the entire game end to end, and it's not even having playtesters or even your key team playing the game by the rules, because there might not be any rules at this point. You might have some rough notes, or it might be living in your head, but the idea is that you're talking through or maybe playing through the game or part of the game. And when I say talk through, it might be like, oh yes, I think maybe the red team is going to do these things during this point, and then the blue team might respond in this way. And that allows you to also do things like, okay, does the blue team have something interesting to do at this point, or do we need to change the rules because they're just going to be sitting there bored, or they're going to be sitting there without any agency? Like, okay, how do we make sure that everybody has interesting and meaningful choices, or how do we make sure that we're capturing player outputs in certain ways, and that there's balance if that's important. And so you're usually like talking through the game from beginning to end, improvising and refining as you go. If you're actually playing something out, it's totally okay if you don't have rules written down, but a facilitator can just be like riffing and saying, okay, we don't have mechanics yet for this, but let's just say it resolves in this way or that way, or maybe this is a time where dice roll makes sense, that type of thing. The why of this, the goal is to learn quickly. So in general, I think like the more you can accelerate getting something to any kind of test, whether it's a playstorm or more formal playtest, the better, because you start learning. You start realizing what are the questions we didn't even know to ask when we were starting to design. It allows you to also test against the goals. So like maybe you're talking through, playing through something, and you're having fun, and through some of the improvise, you end up at something different than you expected. You can then say, hey, does this different thing still hit our goals? Are our goals intention in some way that we didn't realize? And it'll let you hopefully start surfacing some insights there. Also let you generate new ideas. Oftentimes, if you have some very good improvisers as players, they'll try and do something that your game didn't initially support, and that's a great opportunity to say, hey, that's a good idea, let's bake that in, or how do we make it so that anybody can do this very creative thing that these power players may have just done when we were playstorming. So you come up with new ideas, and again, align the team, because every step of this is about continuing to align the team and figure out, is this accomplishing our goals, and do we feel good about this direction? So with some playstorming out of the way, then you can, once you're like more confident in the actual cohesive set of rules, you can formalize them, write them down, and start playtesting. And there's a lot of different types of playtests, going from like very, very rough to very polished in terms of where the game is at. But you're probably running the full game. You might be running, if it's easy to, just a subset of the game, but in higher fidelity, maybe just for one faction if there are multiple factions. Or maybe you just really need to do a thorough playtest of just the first round to make sure that the first round works. It's still okay. Maybe you're doing this to test different audiences. So with the FutureCast game, we brought in a bunch of civil society folks and tested with them, and then we brought in a bunch of youths, college-age youths who were not formally involved in like the future of democracy in this country, and to test it with them. And the idea was, okay, we know we want the game to work with these different audiences. Let's actually test it and see what we learn, see where people get stuck or confused. And sometimes you can also be playtesting to answer specific design questions, like, oh, we really don't know if this moment in round 3 is going to work, or this mechanic is going to work, or we really don't know if these handouts are actually helpful at helping players make decisions. So you might specifically structure a playtest to answer a question that is an open risk or concern that you just need to vet with actual players. So in terms of like types of playtests, we've already hit this a little bit, but you might be testing the game itself. Is the game fun? Does it get the kind of outputs that you want? You might be testing the balance if it's a game that needs balance, and not every game does. But play through it, and do the factions feel like they all have meaningful things to do, and that anyone has a chance of winning, if that's, again, part of the constraint. Likewise, be testing the instructions. This is usually a little further on, but you can do a type of playtest where you hand the instructions off to a facilitator or to a group of players if there is no facilitator, and say, hey, read this through, play the game, we're just going to watch you. And then you're really learning, like, not only is the game good and successful for your goals, but like, are the instructions successfully written to set up people to play the game? Two different things. And finally, there's like testing the facilitation. So if you do have facilitators, you might want to run a few times through to see, have you trained the facilitators well, and what are the edge cases that might come up that facilitators aren't going to have a good answer for, so that you can come up with answers for them and train facilitators to be ready to handle them. With playtests done, then you're on to the more formal publish or launches, which is going to look very different depending on the game, depending on the situation. Things that you might do to publish, getting physical and digital versions live, having facilitation guides, and run of show. I'm a big fan of a run of show that in many of our games will have a down to the minute what happens. So okay, 20 minutes in, all right, we're going to set a timer for 10 extra minutes, and we're going to give people a chance to lock in their big interventions that they've been brainstorming. And then the players, when they lock them in, we're going to go, after the end of those 10 minutes, we're going to bring everybody back to the main stage. Those types of cues of who's doing what when. And oftentimes we'll have different facilitator roles. Somebody's going to be the timekeeper. Somebody's going to be in charge of handouts. Somebody's going to be in charge of presenting at the stage. And we'll color code that on the run of show so each facilitator knows exactly what they need to be doing when. A good way of making sure that you don't need to be one of the game designers to be able to run this thing. Other things in there will have customization advice. I love it when a game says, hey, hack and remix me, customize me to your local context. And so oftentimes that's about saying, okay, cool, here are things to keep in mind when you're customizing it. Here are some things that we learned as part of the design process. And ideally you have templates too. So you're not just uploading the final version of the game in a PDF, but you maybe have the production file that people can then edit directly, make their lives as easy as possible to customize it. And finally, case studies can be really helpful too. So if somebody's thinking about adopting it, they can see how it's been used and the impact that it's had. That's all on the publishing side. On the launch side, if you're depending on why you're creating this game, how it's embedded in broader workflows, you're doing the actual play sessions to generate the insights that are needed downstream. You're maybe doing some sense making or synthesis out of what came out of those play sessions. You're handing things off to downstream workflows. You're measuring your impact, and of course you're doing whatever press and marketing is needed. And that could be press and marketing outside the organizations to help spread the word that this game is out and other people should be playing and using it. And maybe that's about running demos of the game. But at the same time, there's also internal press and marketing of, hey, organization, we did this thing and had these results. Be excited. If it's an ongoing project, be engaged. If you're thinking about doing something similar, let us know and we'll help you design a game or we'll help you remix it. Those types of things. So with that, you've seen now the whole stage gate process, and you can take this, tweak this, alter it to your own needs. This is how I tend to do it, but depending on what your process might look like, what your team might look like, make it work for you. But I really love this frame, and hopefully now you see why. And I find it's so good at helping all the collaborators, whether they have game experience or not, go on this journey with you and really be effective at participating, collaborating, and ultimately helping everybody get to a final point that meets those core goals that you outlined originally, and sticks within the constraints and succeeds. So with that, a few last thoughts to leave you about working with organizations, especially bigger organizations, is on both attitude and behavior. So attitude, you got to be patient. Sometimes big organizations can move really slowly. They have other priorities, and so you just need to know that they're not going to move at the same pace that you're going to move at or want to move at, and that's okay. You're going to be nurturing because a lot of folks are going to come in with different contexts, different degrees of familiarity with games. Maybe some haven't played games since they were kids, and that's okay. They can still be really amazing collaborators. You want to be flexible because constraints can change or preferences might be in tension. Endlessly curious about the why certain constraints exist or why people have concerns, and creative at overcoming those. And so like a specific example there, I mean, we've worked with folks who somebody comes in and says, hey, we cannot call this a game because otherwise the senior folks in the organization are going to think it's trivial, not take it seriously, and not participate. We go, okay, this is not a game. This is a participatory exercise, or whatever you want to call it. On the behavior side, you're constantly going to want to be realigning the team and making sure everyone's on the same page. You're going to want to be educating both people internal to your team and external to your team about what you're doing, because these types of projects can be very illegible, especially to organizations and collaborators who have never thought about games in this way. Finally, you're going to want to be interpreting what people say, even if they don't have the right words or language to articulate it in terms of their preferences for what this game might be, adapting to changing circumstances, and you're going to iterate. Like I think you saw through the stage gate process, it's so much about iteration. So the more you can iterate, the more you can foster learning, the more you can then reincorporate and keep everyone aligned. So with that being said, thank you for checking this out and listening to me. If you have your own thoughts on how to best collaborate and co-design games and Foresight games with others, I'd love to hear it. Feel free to leave comments below or reach out to me. Once again, I'm Randy Lubin. I'm with Leveraged Play. It's my consultancy that designs serious games for exploring the future and explaining complex systems. If you want to collaborate, reach out to me, randy@leveragedplay.com. Would love to hear it. And also, if you're curious, even if you're curious, or especially if you're designing in this space, please join the Foresight Games community. We're a global group of game designers, and folks who are not game designers but excited about these games, who just want to talk about how do we deploy games to explore the future. We have an email list and a Discord, and it's just a really, really nice and smart and enthusiastic crew. So I'd love to see you join us if this has even a remote bit of interest to you. So please join. Otherwise, thank you again for your time. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you around. Take care.